Is it okay if I call you Dominic? Because I can't
Yes,
pronounce the other
yes.
name.
You and everyone else. I never um, considered that fact, but I chose a global username for myself.
Okay, so the reason I needed your help is because I'm trying to create this endless runner, but it
Yes.
has a bit of complexity in the sense that I'm trying to add 4 levels to the game, and I want in for each level the character to have a different graphical asset attached to it, and so basically the character should look differently in every level, and so should the uh, items that the player can collect. And not only that, but I basically want to have customized options for each level. So I also want the character to have different jump functionalities. So in
Mm,
each
okay.
level, it should have different jumping mechanics, I guess. And also the platforms in each level and the floor should have different traits in the sense that maybe in the first level I don't want any gaps, and in the second maybe I want bigger gaps in the floor, and then in the third level maybe I want to introduce platforms. So I'm trying to figure out how you would approach building something like this.
Okay. Um, we're going to touch on some programming concepts here as well. So, but I'll try to explain it in layman's terms so it's more um, understandable. I don't know how much you've managed to go and do on your own. Um,
Not much.
that's fine. That's fine. Um, in which case, I'll treat you as if you're new to programming. Um, so the way you described it, so let's start with the character. You said you want a character that's um, different for each level, but it also has some fundamentally similar logic, I assume. Like you would
Exactly.
say, it has gravity associated with it, but
Mm-hmm.
one of the levels it can jump or something. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know exactly. Um, but something you can do is it's called in programming it's called inheritance, where you have a parent class that has like common logic,
Mm-hmm.
and then you would have children classes or child classes that um, have have different behaviors based off of the original, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So probably how you're going to end up playing it out is you're going to have 4 different characters, and they derive from like a single parent class. And FRVR or the Forge engine actually allows something like that. Um, I had spoken to Chris about it, and he'd actually implemented it so that you can do something like that.
Okay.
Fortunately for you, the AI also understands um, what you're talking about if you use the right keywords.
Okay.
So if you were to say create a character class, um, and then you can, however you want to define it, and then you can say create a new character level 1 class that inherits from the character class, and then you say when it jumps or whatever, do this instead of that. Um, in which case, the AI most of the time actually understands what you want to do with it. I'm sure you've seen in the source code. I don't know how much you've looked into it, but maybe I can share an example. So in FRV or in the Forge engine, all the classes are constructed from something called this container. So you
Okay.
have expand, and then you have container.call. And basically, all that does is they have a function somewhere that you can't see that you're calling that creates this game object that is a container. So a container can have bits and pieces in it. So it has some graphical assets and it has some logic to it and it has an x and a y coordinate. And I'm sure I don't know how much of that stuff you've looked into, or whether you've just done the AI stuff.
Not much, to be honest, but from what I'm getting, so basically a container is like a vessel that contains information.
Perfect, yeah. And it
Okay.
can have graphics and whatever else. So
Okay.
you would a container doesn't look like anything. It's just, as you say, it's a vessel for logic or
Mm-hmm.
vessel for information. But you
Okay.
can also attach, like, yeah, you can say, um, this is a background class that I had, and it just says this is a container and it has a background graphics, and I set the width and the height to it, and it has a function in it. But yeah,
Okay.
that's all there is to it. So you can attach an asset using the self.attach. Um, so yeah, it's a vessel that can have images and logic in it. So
So
I think.
in the context of the endless runner, would I create a container for the player class?
Mm. So when you tell the AI create a character class, it will create you something that looks more or less like this. It's
Mhm.
a it knows to say, okay, we're calling the container class. It has a graphic that's the player, so you'll have an image somewhere that's like the player image and whatever, and then you'll define its logic or tell it what logic it needs to have, and then that'll be your base player. So anything that all four levels of your character will have in it, you can put there, or the default. So let's say in three of the four levels the player can jump, and in the last one you've made it like extra hard that the player can't jump, and
Hmm.
also, whatever. It's a terrible example, but
It's a good
um,
example. I was thinking
so
about
what?
that.
Okay, fantastic. So the point is that you can override logic as well. So a lot of that stuff you yourself aren't going to necessarily get into the nitty gritty of, but you would tell the AI what you wanted, and the AI would do its best. It's just something you might look out for, um, or to keep in mind when make it yourself. When you understand the core concepts of what it's trying to build for you, you can kind of understand what can go wrong because the AI is far from perfect. I'm sure you've got first-hand experience with that.
Definitely
Uh,
did.
It'll only get better, but for now it's a little bit iffy sometimes.
So in this example, would I use a container for all of the four players, or would I use
Okay.
just a container for the player as a whole?
Um. So yeah, let's go into the inheritance and how FRVR does it. So I have this utility class called a config container. This
Okay.
allows me to just create a container, but give it an x and y value straight off the bat, as opposed to doing something like this where it's not like tightly put together. I'd much rather have it's a I guess a semantic programming thing, but it's a small bit of code, and um, the point is more that I've decided that I don't like container anymore. I have a config container that takes in a config object and does something with it, as opposed to just container. And as you will see, like almost all of my classes inherit from config container instead. So
Okay.
so that's like my super class.
Mm-hmm.
if I were to draw like a family tree, you'd have container right at the top, and its only child is like a config container, and the config container has lots of children, and some of those. So I think, let's see where it is. Oh yeah, okay. So I assume you've played Farmer Nebula at some
Mm-hmm.
point.
Mm-hmm.
So you understand I have lots of little plants and they all have sort of similar behavior, but not quite, if
Mm-hmm.
that makes sense. Um, so I have a base plant class, which is up here. Yeah, it's a plant. So you have a plant that inherits from config container. Um, and then I have a whole bunch of other plants. So that's the weed plants, and then there's a stalk plant, and they all inherit from this plant bit. I don't know if you can see well, but
Mm-hmm.
kind of if I drew the hierarchy, you'd have container at the top, then config container, then plant, and then all the different types of plants that go that are children of this plant class.
Okay.
So all the plants have, because it's a child of the plant class, they all behave like a plant because I have some default logic for a plant that plants do this and they grow and they can be harvested, and then for um, yeah, and then for the individual types of plants, they tweak that logic slightly or they add extra logic. Like some things will automatically die, others will only drop a certain amount. Um, yeah, so that if you relate it to your class or what you want to do with your characters, you'd have one base player class, and then you'd have your four classes that just kind of tweak the logic a little bit, but or as much or as little as they want.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to go this route. That's the other thing. You can just create four different classes. That's um, if you were going to do it with your non-programming background, you would probably just say, okay, I'm going to create four different classes. I'm going to put the logic in there. The reason you may not want to go that route is if you want to tweak how a character jumps, then you'd have to do it for all four classes, and the AI would possibly miss one unless you explicitly told it to, and then it might still as well, because
Mm-hmm.
it sometimes does that. Or you say remove the jump logic from the player one class, and then it will, I mean, the player level one class, and then it'll remove the jump logic from all four of them just because it felt like it, even though you said only this one.
And maybe can you go a bit more in depth into what's the difference between a container and a class?
Oh, okay. So that's a very good question and a very difficult question to answer.
Okay.
Um, the Forge engine is a very old version of JavaScript.
Okay.
So they don't use classes in it. I think it's for compatibility with Facebook, I imagine.
Okay.
So, um, how do I say this? So, in classes were only introduced in a later version of JavaScript as like a native kind of way to do it, but there were older ways to get around it because JavaScript's quite a it was like a hack job. It was pieced together in a few days, and then it became the backbone of the internet, and the rest is history.
Okay.
Don't get me wrong, I love JavaScript, but it does have its downsides.
Mm.
So essentially, a container is just a function that acts like a class. So the AI will understand what you mean by a container or a class or an object. Like all of those things, the AI kind of can pick apart and be like, okay, he probably means I need this thing, or yeah. But once you start going into more, when you start using more program related terminology, you might need to say things like, okay, this is a class. This is specifically a container object, which the AI interprets as a class. And it's going to have its own logic. A class means that you can create instances of it. So if if I go to the plants example in from a nebula, I've defined the object once, but I can spawn multiple um, objects into the game world.
They sort of function in the same way, but the container acts more like a parent and the class like a child.
Um, I should actually say that a container is the name of the most parent class.
Okay.
So the container is a class.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and with the classes, I can basically create copies of the container.
Yes, exactly. Because you've
Okay.
said this is now a class that you can create instances of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So in the code, you would have something that says, this is what the player's logic is. This is the vessel that the player looks like, and this is the logic that it has. And but you could actually spawn four of them into the world without having four of the same classes, or I mean, four snippets of that code. If that makes
Okay,
sense.
so in my case, for the four characters, I would create a container that contains most of the logic for jumping and running and gravity and whatever. And then I would have four different classes, which are the exact uh, player containing also their graphical assets. But in the container, I wouldn't necessarily have graphics, but maybe just the logic. And then each class is the actual player character. Does that make sense?
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. So your four child classes would have the graphical asset,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and they would look different because you've said, okay, this one has this picture and this one has that picture.
Mm-hmm.
And then because you've done it like that, and if that's all the changes you make is just in those four classes, they would behave exactly the same, because they're obviously using their parent player class's logic, but they would just look different,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which is
Okay, and for maybe the floor, let's say, I would use a similar approach where I would have a container for how the floor behaves, maybe like its
mm,
speed or gravity, and then again I would have a class for each level where it behaves different in each level.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's quite this challenge is quite a I mean this competition run is actually quite challenging for someone that doesn't know how to program, because I've done a few of these types of games, these endless runner games now, um, like my firefly is a type of endless runner,
Mm.
and like the ski game is a endless runner, and the kind of the one similarity that like all those games have is that there's some kind of level generator. It has to like continuously generate and destroy bits of the level. So that I thought the way that you did your ninja game was so clever because it's an endless runner, but you're not necessarily generating and regenerating like parts of the level. It's you're going up and things are coming down, and it works so well. Like you've got the screen as the level, so very clever.
Thank you. Um, okay. Yeah, I'm still wrapping my mind around these containers and classes, and I guess maybe I can't fully figure it out right now, but maybe levels would also need to have a container, and everything else maybe is a child of the levels. So maybe the levels would be the main parent of everything, but I'm not fully sure if that's the correct
Mm.
way to do
I
it.
don't think so. There's a difference between making a child of a class and attaching another class to it. So just because the level class has the player in it doesn't mean it's derived from the same parent, if that makes sense. Or
Okay.
so you I think what you were saying about having four different level classes that like generate differently is probably um correct.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um it depends how you want to go about it, but
So that's the thing. I mean, the way I envisioned it is the game has levels, and the levels need to progress gradually. So we start with level one, then move on to
yes.
level two, and so on. And that's why I imagine that this might actually be the foundation for which on which the game is built, so that it knows there's a sequence of levels, or at least it needs to know
Yeah.
that levels are a thing.
Yeah. That that makes sense. Um it's not something I personally tried to ask the AI to do, having multiple levels. This transitioning for Formula Nebula, which is kind of similar because it has different levels, but you can just go backwards and forwards between them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's kind of similar in that sense, but I had to detach and reattach the planets, and it was the AI didn't understand what was going on because it's not a use case that it was used to.
But then, how would you approach adding the actual levels? Like, how would you implement the concept of levels in this
Yeah,
runner?
I do think that um yeah, so probably the best way to go about it would be you have um let's say your character is in a fixed point in the screen. Um actually let me show you another one of mine. Um uh, this road horrible. Yeah. So this Roadrunner is probably a good example of it.
Okay.
So the character stays in one position in the screen, and the level kind of generates around it,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to you're trying to you've set out this whole level, and then you're kind of like moving the player along in the level, because I
Mm,
don't think the engine is strong enough to handle so many entities and collision detection and that kind of thing.
mhm.
So what you see on the screen is kind of everything that exists. Maybe this wasn't the best one. Um, with Froggy Firefly, which is a similar kind of concept. Is there a way to turn off the music? Probably not. Wait, there we go. It's not playing music now, right?
No, no, I can't hear
Okay,
anything.
fantastic. Um, so kind of, with the lily pads at the bottom, the level says, okay, every between 500 and or every 10 to 500 distance create a lily pad, and then
Mhm,
when the lily pad is far to the left, destroy it.
mhm.
And when the player moves a certain amount, instead of the player moving, you shift everything else, if that makes sense, because your player is kind of stuck on the same point of the screen. He just goes up and down,
Mm, okay.
which is kind of different from how um, your ninja moves, because he goes all the way up and down the screen. And
Mhm, mhm.
yeah. The point is
Okay.
that you should consider how you want to generate your levels. So if you imagine that it's if your player's kind of moving from left to right, your generator creates blocks on the right and slowly moves them across. Um,
I just want to clarify things uh, because
yes.
I have a feeling that you might be talking about something different. So I would, so the elements in the level would be generated around the character, so the character would never move. It would just have a
Mm,
same position and just jump around, and everything else will be created around it. When I'm talking about levels, I'm talking more like so I want, for example, for a level to have a finite amount of time, and maybe I want the
yes.
time to be different. Or I
Yes.
also want to add some text on the screen inside the level, so I need to describe to the game what level we are currently in, so it
Yeah.
knows what text to call. So maybe those are the sort of information that I want to include in a level.
Yes.
Does that
So
change anything?
it does. And I realized that I hadn't answered your question because I was too concerned about the generation.
Mhm.
So it's actually quite simple to do that level progression. You can say, okay, after the player, in quotes there, has moved 10,000 distance, then stop generating level 1 and start generating level 2.
Mm. Mhm.
And kind of you'd have that transition automatically because you've just swapped how the generation um, works.
Mhm.
Um, and then it would kind of, I guess, seamlessly transition. Um, although then you'd also swap out what the which player you were using at the time, and um, yeah, I suppose how you want to architect it depends on what you want out of it. If you want the screen to go black and then you're like, okay, that's the end of level 1, let's go all the way to level 2. Okay, that's a little bit um, different, and it's also quite easily done. Because you'd have your I don't know if you know, but there is a Where is it now? Yeah. So right at the tippity top of the game kind of world
Mm,
is this game instance. That's also a type of container, but you can't change like certain things about it. So everything is attached to this game. If you imagine it's a container that um, draws everything that's in the game world.
mm,
So what? mm, Quite simply, you can say, okay, when the game starts, attach level one to the game. And then when you're done level one, you're like, okay, I destroyed level one, create level two. Level two contains the player that it needs. Level one contained its own player. And then you could keep something like a score as a separate kind of container. But yeah,
mhm,
it's quite simple in that regard. If you want to do a clear cut, destroy everything, now it's a new thing.
mhm, mhm,
And the AI should be able to understand that quite easily, I'd say. So you create a container that's level one, um, and you say, okay, in your level one, add the player. In level one, add the level one generator. In level one, add the level one hazard generator or enemies or whatever you might want in it. And then you can say, okay, when the player has moved so much distance or got so many points, then destroy level one and add level two,
mhm,
where you've done a similar kind of setup.
mhm. Okay, I think I have a rough idea of how to build this. I mean, I would still need to think of how to create the architecture,
Mm,
but this was definitely useful, and I'm hoping to figure out how to put everything together to actually make it work. Because I mean, I think I have everything I need. Like you gave me all the puzzle pieces. Now I just have to put them
mm.
together and try to create a game.
I'm glad to hear that. That's all that programming is you understand the puzzle pieces you can build with, and then you're like, okay, let's build the best thing I can with this.
Fundamentally fun games.